Hello, and welcome to our unit on Puritan literature. You should know that this video will provide an extremely brief overview of Puritan history, values, and literature. This video is meant to outline information that will help you to contextualize and analyze the unit text, but I encourage you to conduct your own research and read the biographical information attached to each of the unit readings. So, without further ado, we'll start with some brief historical context. Introducing the Puritans. In the early 17th century, thousands of English Puritans settled in North America, mainly in New England. The Puritans were a group of English Protestants who had sought to purify the Church of England and return to simpler ways of worshiping. Their efforts had been most unwelcome in England, however, and many left the country for America to escape persecution. Puritan settlers believed themselves chosen by God to create a new order in America. John Winthrop, for example, wrote in 1630 that, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." Puritans' values directed and shaped almost every aspect of their lives. They saw human struggle with sin as a daily mission and believed, above all else, that the Bible would help them through the torments of human weakness. Although they felt that humans were essentially sinful, they believed that some, the elect, would be spared from eternal punishment by God's grace. Hard work, thrift, and responsibility were seen as morally good, a sign that God was working within. The thriving settlements and financial success that grew from these qualities were thought to be a mark of God's approval. However, Puritanism had a dark side as well. Puritans tended to be inflexible in their religious faith and intolerant of viewpoints other than their own. In one famous case, the Salem Witchcraft trials, a whole community fell victim to the hysteria of the witch hunt, ending with more than 20 people dead by execution. So now we'll move on to the Puritan tradition and writing. Puritan writers had their own purposes for recording history. They believed writing should be useful, a tool to help readers understand the Bible and guide them in their daily lives. In other words, their writing provided moral instruction. For this reason, logic, clarity, and order were more prized in writing than beauty or adornment. One Puritan compared adorned writing to stained glass windows. The paint upon the glass may feed the fancy, but the room is not well lighted by it. Using a familiar, down-to-earth metaphor such as this to make a deeper point is a common feature of Puritan writing. The direct, powerful, plain language of much of American literature owes a debt to the Puritans. Now we'll discuss Puritan Sermons. The works of Puritan writers such as Cotton Mather and Jonathan Edwards include histories of the colonies and fiery sermons on the dangers of sinful ways. Imagine the scene when Edwards first delivered his sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." The congregation quaking in fear from Edwards's vivid descriptions of hellfire and a vengeful God. "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," while perhaps more fiery than most, is typical of the Puritan sermon. Melodramatic contrast between good and evil, vivid imagery, powerful language, and strong moral lessons characterized this form of literature. Let's move on now to Puritan poetry. So, most Puritan writers composed plain sermons, histories, and treatises, but poetry was the means of expression for others. In fact, the first book issued in the North American colonies was the Bay Psalm Book in 1640, in which the Bible's psalms were rewritten to fit the rhythms of familiar Puritan hymns. Puritan poets such as Anne Bradstreet and Edward Taylor viewed poetry primarily as a means of exploring the relationship between the individual and God. We'll spend a little more time with each of these poets, starting with Anne Bradstreet. Bradstreet's poems reflect her wide learning, deep faith, and love for her husband and children. They also provide insight into the position of women in the male-dominated Puritan society. Her book of poetry, The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America, was the first work by a North American woman to be published. She's a very impressive lady. By now, you've probably recognized that there are several elements and characteristics that distinguish Puritan writing. Now I'll discuss some of the most important elements in further detail. Number 1. Focus on God and the Bible. The Puritans' writing reflected their religious beliefs, and the Bible was their inspiration. Calvinist in their theology, Puritans believed in the absolute sovereignty of God, the idea that God is in complete control of events and ultimately works all things out for a believer's good. As a result, many of their writings dealt with these themes of God's will and God's master plan. Number 2. The hardships of life in the colonies. Puritan writing often dealt with those difficulties that the writers were facing. For instance, William Bradford's chronicle opens with the Pilgrims' winter arrival in the Cape Cod wilderness. A search party explores the land and survives a surprise conflict with Native Americans. Conditions are dire, and many in the group starve or fall ill. Finally, the local native people help them find food and ways to survive. Number 3. Symbolism of everyday events. In addition to simply relating the day-to-day struggles of life, the Puritans saw them as symbols or divine messages. For instance, a paper cut could mean that God wanted a person to stop writing so many letters to his non-religious sister, or a woman who burned her husband's shirt could see that as a warning to prepare for his death. Moreover, Anne Bradstreet's poems reveal how every event, no matter how trivial, carries a divine message. Each blessing or loss reveals God's will and an opportunity for spiritual growth. Number 4. Inward reflection. Many Puritan texts are in the form of diaries or personal narratives because there was a heavy focus on inward reflection. Through this self-reflection, the Puritans would often discover spiritual meaning in what might be considered simple coincidences. Number 5. Simple and plain style. Life is difficult for the Puritans, and they did not have or seek luxuries. Their writing style reflected their reality. They used plain language, opting for simpler words over fancy or flowery ones.